Welcome to the Toronto Debating Society for January 25th. Tonight's motion is Historic Preservation Trumps Property Rights. And our first speaker tonight for the Prime Minister will be Adrian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House. The resolution before us today is Historic Preservation Trumps Property Rights. And the resolution is defined as follows. Historic preservation is defined as protection of structures of cultural and architectural significance as designated by the City of Toronto. Trumps shall supersede/override. And property rights are defined as the rights owners generally have in regards to determining how they use and maintain structures they own. There are three main reasons why the government supports this resolution. The first reason is the importance of cultural preservation. People are hungry for culture. They're hungry for the ties that bind them to the past and serve as an anchor to the future. They want to have and experience tangible pieces of history, which may include structures such as buildings as defined in the resolution. This hunger is huge. For example, Open Doors Toronto, where people were allowed to go into historical structures, were attended by over 200,000 people. People are desiring to know more about the past, to know more about what has come before them. And it is for that reason why cultural preservation and historical preservation is so important. For example, if the property rights were allowed to override historical preservation, Old City Hall in Toronto would not exist, for example. The Distillery District would not exist, for example. Queen Street West, with all those mid-century homes and businesses would not exist. And so we have to compare the overriding need, the overriding benefit of society to the rights of a property owner to build a mall, to build a condominium, to make money building some nondescript townhouses and totally eradicate what was left of our history. The government believes that when the choices are between those two options, between eradication and between preservation, when the choices are between property rights superseding historical preservation, we believe that society is better served when historical preservation rules. We believe that society is better served when historical preservation is placed on a higher plane than the owner of one building, or one owner of one building, one owner of one structure, to do what he or she wants with a property. The second point that we, go ahead.
I'm just, in terms of tangible experiences, what makes a building more important than a tangible experience like Remembrance Day parades or the Festival of Lights or other experiences that are cultural?
Well, the resolution as defined is defined as build structures as designated by the City of Toronto. If we were talking about parades as being historical, we could talk about Remembrance Day parade. Our second point is one that property rights have never been absolute. Just because you own a property, just because you own a structure, doesn't mean you can do what you want with it when you want with it. There are rules, there are zoning rules, for example, where you can say you can't build a residential structure in a business area, or you can't build an industrial structure in a commercial zone. There are rules for expropriation where the government can say, well, yes, you own this property, but it's needed for the greater good. It's needed for a greater cause. It's needed for a subway or a highway or schools which are designed to serve many, many, many more people and to serve many more interests than just one person. There has never been a legal right enshrined in the Canadian Constitution which states that you have the right to own property. And because there has never been that right, and because the use of property has always been, in modern times, the desire to serve more people, that has always been an option, we believe that this option should be used to support the resolution. Go ahead.
Even though the Canadian Constitution guarantees, quote, the right of the individual to use and enjoyment of property and the right not to be deprived thereof.
The Constitution also, though, guarantees that society makes it clear that society as a whole needs to benefit as well. There's always a competing interest, but we are arguing that when it comes to historical preservation, that competing interest, historical preservation, should win out because of the greater benefits it has to more people. And our third point is one concerning safety. For far too long, the historical designation laws in the City of Toronto are so lax that even though we can't force you to maintain a property, we can't force you to even do repairs on a property. And this provides a safety issue to people who are working, living, walking past these properties. For example, the Empress Hotel Empress Hotel collapse and fire that happened over the span of a couple of months. We don't believe that property rights should trump historical preservation, especially when preserving history is going to save lives, preserving history is going to save businesses, preserving history is going to be much more beneficial to a larger group of people. For all of these reasons, Madam Speaker, we believe the government's resolution should stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. I'd now like to call on Margie to talk for 7 minutes to give the case for the opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We believe in the opposition that historic preservation cannot trump property rights. Property rights are not to be trifled with. It sounds like a matter for the rich. It is in fact a fundamental matter for humans going back thousands of years. Property rights, when they're not secure, lead to conflict and even wars. The most common example used in this thesis is Colombia's Civil War, due to lack of secure ownership of property. But often property rights and the lack of security in developing countries inhibits the development. So it's not something that you just toss away without a serious consideration, something that you do on an emotional whim. Property rights are fundamental to democracy. So when we're talking about something overriding property rights, as sometimes things do, we find that it must meet a very high standard. And we do not believe that the government has made a case for that very high standard. We find in our research that property rights are often overridden on the terms of using the term historic in an arbitrary fashion. For example, the government brought up the Empress Hotel. The Empress Hotel was bought by developers with the intent of tearing down an old building and building a new tower. It was not designated a heritage building until they made the application to demolish it. There was no reason to expect in their due diligence ahead of time that they would not be able to use the property that they purchased with their money as they saw fit. It was in fact done as a reaction, a sort of override of their own rights because of the whim of the city that decided that they would, once they knew what they were going to do with it, then declare it to be a heritage property. Yes?
is the opposition saying that government cannot override property rights for any reason?
I'm saying they must meet a very high standard to override property rights, and I find that historic preservation does not match that standard. I will give a few examples of when property rights have been used arbitrarily, and often at the disadvantage of disadvantaged people. A classic case this past summer was what is known as the 204 Beach Avenue case in the Beaches. This was a home that was purchased by a family. It had no historic designation, and they chose to demolish the 100-year-old home in order to build an accessible home for the wife and mother who was quadriplegic. The existing home wasn't. They did their due diligence ahead of time. No historic designation, no problem. Immediately there was an uproar once they announced their plans to demolish. Are you seeing a pattern here? And the neighbors, regardless of needs for current accessibility issues, decided that this was suddenly a property that had great historic importance, even though it was a hodgepodge of styles and what they considered to be the quintessential piece of the house, which was a turret, wasn't even built to the 1970s. And they actually tried to block this under the historic preservation. And in this case, sanity won out, and it was not designated historic. But it could have been, the wheels were in motion, and as you saw, it can happen, as it did with the hotel. So the question here is, who determines what is historic? And how do we keep that from being some sort of fascist, imperialistic, arbitrary, sort of Russian experience where anything inconvenient is suddenly given a designation so that others can do what they want with it? For example, we can look at such things as medieval Paris, or a free African-American village in the US, or the Waldorf Astoria hotels central to New York City social life, or the Circus Neroni, all quality, important historical value. Yes?
As the City of Toronto City Council determines historical designation, are you saying that City Council is a fascist organization?
I'm saying we have to be careful that they not become one. So what I'm saying here is that I just listed off some historic venues. They were all destroyed. What's in their place? Paris today, iconic. Central Park, center of New York. The Empire State Building stands where the iconic Waldorf Astoria once stood. And St. Peter's Basilica is where the Circus Neroni was. So who decides what's historic? Who decides what's important to save such that you override what somebody else might be doing? We construct buildings with a specific use in mind, but fashion, economics, and technology start to intervene almost from the outset. When you want plumbing, when you want electricity, when you want a place to put your car instead of your horses. So it is not just something to willy-nilly say, it's old, we gotta keep it. And without some serious consideration to property rights, you cannot just override individual mandates. And if you want to save something, and I'm not saying it's not important to save something, pay for it, buy it. The U.S. National Historic Trust for Preservation is considered the main around the world, the main model. They're a privately funded nonprofit. They pay to restore. They'll take properties off your hands, or they'll help subsidize your renovations. You can't just go in and dictate to the few what you think the many may want. Individual property rights are a cornerstone of Western civilization, not just in Toronto, but especially in Toronto. And we state that in order for the city to grow and remain vibrant, we have to have a mix, we have to allow growth, we have to allow change. Like a shark will die if we stop swimming. So who's to say that what we tear down today and replace, that new thing won't become the iconic Toronto image tomorrow? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Margie. I would now like to ask Reagan to come up and speak for 5 minutes as the seconder for the government.
The government stands in its position that historical rights, historical preservation should trump property rights. Our friends in the opposition, unfortunately, have painted a very extreme picture of the measure that we are proposing today. Nobody is saying that property rights are not important. Nobody is saying that property rights aren't essential to a free and democratic society. However, like any other right in a free and democratic society, there are reasonable limitations. There has to be reasonable limitations. No right can be exercised absolutely, otherwise people's rights will conflict. What we have here is a system in Toronto that allows the City Council to decide. City Council is an elected body. Therefore, if it's a democratically elected body, it can't suddenly fall into, to quote the opposition, fall under the auspices of fascism and imperialism so suddenly. The people have been elected for a reason. Yes! The bell rang and
I'd like to ask you, you quote the City Hall as elected representatives. Have they been elected specifically to identify which is an historic building, which isn't?
They have not been elected to specifically identify which is an historic building or not. However, they've been entrusted by the people, the voters, to nominate people on the historical committee to recognize and make recommendations to the City Council as to which buildings should stand as should be preserved for historical purposes and which should not. How much more democratic can you get than that?
So is this like a rule by the masses? What qualifies the City Council to decide what's historic and what's not?
Democratic prerogative. They've been elected by the people, and that's the most powerful form of prerogative you can have in a democratic society. They've been elected. Now, the opposition have brought up Section 7 of the Charter of Rights regarding property and civil rights. Again, as anyone who's studied the Charter knows, every right enunciated in the Charter is limited. It's limited by Section 1, which provides that any right prescribed in the Charter is limited to what is reasonable in a free and democratic society. Again, just goes to the point that nobody here on the government is advocating for fascism or imperialism. They're just asking for a little bit of reasonability and a little bit more thought into what we destroy in the name of progress. Anyone who's ever taken a walk down the lake shore of Toronto for the past 20 years has seen what progress can cost you. We've destroyed a lot of buildings to build more and more condominiums. One of the biggest issues that in the most recent city election had to do with what are we going to do with Toronto's waterfront? Well, once you've built these condos and you've built these shoeboxes in the sky, there's very little you can do once the buildings have been built up. And so we say that sometimes progress, for the sake of progress, is not progress at all, because it creates more problems than it solves. As for the Beach Avenue case, that was an example of the democratic process working. Somebody bought the house. They wanted to change the house. The neighbors and the local community opposed it, and there were hearings as to whether or not the house was 204 Beach Avenue was eligible for the renovations being proposed. And yes, to use the words of the opposition, sanity won. It's not, and the sanity was not in the decision that was made, but in the process of reaching that decision. That's where the sanity was, because people, both for and against the proposal, were allowed to express themselves, they were entitled to be heard, and they had a chance to have the project decided by an impartial third party. That, again, goes to the democracy, and that goes against the democracy that we, as the government, are supporting and are seeking here. It's the democracy that we're seeking, that underpins the motion that's put before us. We're not saying, we're not trying to make Canada Colombia. We're not trying to, we're not opposed to new buildings and new facilities. We're just saying that before you go off and start building new things, you take a moment and you think about the historical impact that such construction could have. Where would Poland be without Auschwitz? Where would Amsterdam be without Anne Frank's house? Where would Paris be without the Louvre? Those are all historical icons, and they all have been preserved. They all exist on prime real estate that would make a nice place for another shopping mall, another Walmart, or another condominium. But those cities and those countries have decided not to destroy them. Why? Because they recognize that for part of human culture and part of being a human being is the importance of being able to experience history, not just through one-time parades, not just through DVDs or movies, but to actually go to the sacred, to the hallowed grounds, touch, feel, and immerse themselves into these historical sites. In doing so, historical awareness is increased, and in doing so, our common history as mankind is shared and is celebrated. And that's why we, the government, stand in favor of the motion as proposed.
Thank you very much, Reagan. I would like to now ask Jim to come up and deliver 5 minutes as member of the opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to member of the government's points just now, and then go further into the PM's points, and then get back to the main opposition points that we are standing to oppose on this motion. The first major one, which was my point of information, the City of Toronto is being used here as an example to come up with buildings that need to be preserved. Well, there is certainly no representative on the city stood for election because they knew how to identify an historic building. So there's absolutely no point in identifying the city or the city councillors as being in any way qualified to do this. And let me just ask the government, who is it that would sit on this committee? Would it be someone who is appointed by the mayor? Like Mr. Ford would have a totally different aspect of what should be preserved than someone, say, who's in charge of the COC or the ROM or something like that. So there's a whole disparity between what the government thinks is pie in the sky and will be wonderful to have and reality. In reality, if a mayor is in charge of the city council and they are looking for business opportunities for people who are coming in from outside of the city, then I'm sorry, but that would just be a quick and easy way to say, no, it has no historical perspective and is not worth keeping. So the idea that an elected body will find someone to do this for them is a non-starter. I'd like to bring up another point about the lakeshore. The member of government brought up the lakeshore and told us how terrible it is because all the historically preserved possibilities have been gone. Well, obviously the member of government has not been for a bike ride down along the lakeshore because there are historic buildings everywhere, and what they are grain silos and old factories and old shipyards and all sorts of things that, to be perfectly honest, I cannot see that they would ever be part of a historic cultural requirement, a cultural preservation that people would be needing. So, ladies and gentlemen, the idea that the lakeshore is an example of what happens when you don't preserve things is also rubbish. Also, the distillery, the Prime Minister brought up the distillery district. Well, anyone who's also been on a bike ride, I bike ride down there a lot, will see, even now, that a lot of those buildings are actually destroyed and are being rebuilt. So the idea that the distillery district is a fantastic idea of what can happen when things are preserved is wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, the leader of the opposition brought up many relevant points, and who is to decide what is historic? We've already dealt with that. Who is to decide what is preserved? Ladies and gentlemen, do you want to preserve everything? Surely, if you're into this preservation process, eventually everything's going to be preserved for some kind of historic reason. And guess what? There won't be anything else that you can build on because everything's going to be historically preserved for some reason or other, because at some stage in the past there was this fantastic cultural process going on inside these grain silos. Fantastic. It doesn't work, ladies and gentlemen. The point that was brought up about every country having their own particular cultural icons like Auschwitz or Anne Frank's house, it's not because of the building itself, ladies and gentlemen, it's because of what went on there. Anne Frank was there. A lot of people perished in Auschwitz. It isn't the building itself, it's the concept of what it is and what it represents. So, ladies and gentlemen, we come back to some of these major issues here. What is it that the government's trying to say? Cultural preservation because some people feel that they're needed or feel that they have something to do with the past. Well, that's great. But is that a reason to override and trump, which, as the government says, supersedes and overrides the rights of the individual? No, ladies and gentlemen, the rights of the individual are sacrosanct. The rights of the individual are what made society what it is today. It's the rights of the individual that are tantamount and trump property rights. Ladies and gentlemen, if we let this motion stand, this is the first step of letting the government tell you what they want to do. The government does not have that right. You have the right to say what you're going to do. If you act legally within society, then you have to stand up for your rights. And ladies and gentlemen, letting the government win this resolution this evening is not standing up for your rights. Ladies and gentlemen, please oppose the motion for all of the reasons my partner and I have explained. Thank you very much.
Thank you, debaters. It was a lively debate. So that ends the formal part of the debate. We're going to call for the summations now. At this point, both the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister will give their final summations. There will be no new evidence introduced at this time. So to start, I would like to ask Margie to come up and speak for the opposition.
Yay!
I'm here to remind you that the government has not in fact made their case well, or possibly even at all. That historic preservation trumps property rights. And just to review that, I'll break it down into three pieces. Property rights. Property rights are so important that they're actually in Canada's Constitution. Historic preservation appears nowhere. It is a main cornerstone of civilization that one has rights to their own property. It's not something that you trifle with or toss out because it's inconvenient or because of the mob rule of the moment. Historic preservation, we haven't been really clear on this. We've said designated by the City of Toronto, although we've determined that the City of Toronto means the City Council and that the City Council doesn't necessarily have any expertise in this and does seem to be subject to political pressure. So historic preservation is a little bit of a fuzzy thing. And then finally, the idea that that fuzzy concept would then trump that very solid concept of property rights, it seems extreme to us, and we don't think that the case has been made that you have to trump property rights to achieve historic preservation. Things like the Distillery District, various One King West hotels, the ROM, they're all saved without intervention and overriding of property rights. It's either because the private property owner finds it worthwhile, or they're an NGO, or they're government owned. It doesn't mean we're going to go on a rampage and burn down the city. The idea is actually a false dichotomy that was set up by the government. I'm afraid they set us up with this false choice: historic preservation, property rights. And we're saying you don't need one to trump the other, and that the government has not made the case that you have to trump. Thank you very much, and please vote no.
Thank you, Margie. I would now like to call on Adrian to come up and put the final summation for the government side.
Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, I should have brought my fishing net. There's so many red herrings on the opposition side of the bench. The opposition has said that we want to impose fascism and communism and that we're being undemocratic, and yet at the very same breath says that having duly elected councillors is somehow wrong. I don't see how they managed to square that circle between democracy and having duly elected city councilors making decisions, who in this democracy are going to make these decisions, that we want to eradicate all rights and turn Canada into a communist state where there are no property rights whatsoever. Ladies and gentlemen, Madam Speaker, that is not what we are proposing. That is not what we ever wanted to propose. All that the government said was that in the case of historical preservation should override property rights. We're not saying that every building out there has to be historically designated, because that doesn't make any sense, Madam Speaker. That's why we didn't say it. The opposition said it. What we are saying is that when it comes down to a conflict of rights, when it comes down to when we have to make a decision between one or the other, that historical preservation, when necessary, should trump individual property rights for the importance of society. That is what we are saying, and that is all we are saying. For those reasons, Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, the motion should stand. Thank you.
Well, thank you, debaters. I'd like to call on Dave to come up and adjudicate the debate and choose the winning side, as well as tell us who he has chosen as the best speaker for the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would actually first like to invite my co-adjudicator, Michael, to actually present what he thought about the definitions. Michael.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I felt that it would have been easier. I was looking for the definition at home because I thought that it could have gone so many ways, and I thought it would have been a bit easier to prove if they had a bit more focus in their definition. To me, it was a bit wishy-washy. For example, trumps in what way? They were talking mostly, it would appear, social considerations, but did not define that, and therefore left themselves wide open for financial aspects because they didn't define it in terms of one or the other, which they could have, I believe. To me, that opened the door for criticism. I think they did a good job of their arguments. Secondly, trumps for who? Is it trumped for the society as a whole or for the individuals? And I think it's who does it trump it for? I think if they'd have focused in on who is being trumped here, it would have been easier to argue. And finally, I think by failing to define what kind of properties we were talking about, residential, commercial, or publicly owned, all of which are different considerations, they opened the door for criticism of any one of those, even though they didn't necessarily bring it up by failing to focus on a specific, or at least covering all three in their arguments. To me, it was a bit wishy-washy and lent itself for refuting. And I'm not saying they didn't do a good job. That's Dave's job. And I'm not saying they jumped in to refute it well. I'm just saying that to me the definition lent itself for somewhat of an unfocused debate. That's all I'm saying.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, I'm going to continue and talk about the debate from all of the different points of view that the adjudicator should. So first of all, talking about arguments. So the Prime Minister came across, and I got three clear arguments. I could exactly tell where your arguments began and where they ended. I had the importance of preservation and how there are rules, there's no absolute rights, and everything. And then the third one about safety. Now, in general, I thought your first 2 points were better. The third one, it didn't really come across to me. I wasn't really quite understanding where safety came into it. And in fact, just hearing the word safety makes me think, well, it's not about historic preservation, it's about safety. So, and I got some grandiose conclusions at the end saying, this will save lives, and it wasn't well articulated to me how. So it wasn't really much of a point there. And for Reagan, government seconder, going again to the reasonable limit and progress costs, and then going into our shared history, which I thought was a very good point, and actually it would have been great to hear about that earlier on, because it kind of became what your entire side was really based upon. It really seemed to go that this is our shared human experience. It's not just talked about, it's lived in our buildings. So those are very good arguments. And over to the opposition, Margie, you had, I would say, maybe 9 points or so. Not numbered, lots of points. It's okay, you don't have to number them, but it really does help me. But so it's okay, it's something along the lines of it's very important not to be trifled with, very high standard required, who determines what's historical, and it's that we need a serious consideration of property, want something to be kept, pay for it. So lots of really strong arguments, very strong arguments. And Jim, from arguments on your side, I didn't really hear many new arguments. I only heard one new argument, which was about the concept, not about the building. And your other main point was just repeating Margie's point of who decides and who's qualified to make these decisions. So some on the opposition side, better arguments. Now content, lots of wonderful content in this debate actually. Tons of examples. We went all over the world, which actually Michael and I were discussing. Should this be allowed? It was in Toronto as the definition. However, no one at any point tried to rein it back. It seemed to be accepted by both teams that we can go outside to show examples of what happens. And I think that's important when we're talking about history, so that was okay. Where it came down to the 204 Beach Avenue apartments that was being proposed, that Margie brought up, saying this is example and sanity prevailed. A great example. I almost thought, like, yes, this is a fantastic example. This could be it right here. But then Reagan came back and used that very same example on his side extremely well, and actually almost destroyed your own point by saying, no, it's the process. So using the same content, you stole it, and you did a fantastic job of stealing that content. I don't see that very often, actually. That was very well done, and it really does a great job of connecting and focusing the debate. So for the benefit of the debate, it was fantastic. And so Reagan, I thought you really brought it back with your examples, and then going back over to Margie and Jim for the opposition. Jim, I thought you had some really good counter examples in terms of, like, Lakeshore is filled with historic buildings. And have you been to the Distillery District? It's a historic district with all new buildings. I thought that was you finished destroying Adrian's first point with that example. So I thought that was very important. And now going down into rebuttal and refutation. Lots of really good rebuttals and refutations in this. A lot of the points, the main arguments, were aimed and timed to really knock at the opposition's and the government's points. They were really well connected. So I thought both teams did well in terms of rebuttal and refutation. It was basically even ground. I thought everyone did a very good job at refuting arguments. For teamwork, I thought, mainly because of what I've already mentioned, that Reagan's point about it's our shared human experience, because that came up late in the debate, I thought the teamwork side was suffering a bit because I didn't feel like your arguments were coming from the same direction. Like if I heard the same kind of theme throughout it, it would be wonderful, but I didn't really hear much of that. And same actually on the opposition side, not as much because there was a lot of common talk about the qualification, the qualification and just the common examples. It was good, but it wasn't wonderful because I felt there were opportunities for you to kind of sync up, and so it still, you did better than the government for teamwork, but there's still room to improve. But you benefited because it seemed like they destroyed their own points with each other. And style and rhetoric, I thought everyone had great style and rhetoric tonight. As of things to point out. Margie saying, "Are you seeing a pattern here?" That was actually a sentence that really drilled the audience to your side, I felt. Like, say, "Are you seeing a pattern here?" It was really well expressed. And Adrian, I just liked your, a lot of your non-sequiturs. And I think my favorite line of yours for tonight, "Oh, I need a fishing net for all these references." It's really funny, it's really entertaining, it's very enjoyable. So on a whole, a very entertaining, very riveting debate, but I did have to give it to the opposition with a score of 56 out of a possible 136 for the government. And it was a very difficult decision. I can't stress this enough actually, this was a very difficult decision of who won Best Debater. Because on one side, I can tell you the contenders were Margie and Reagan. Margie because she came up there and had an absolutely fantastic, stunning, and destructive presentation to Adrian's show. Like, it was almost like my concern with Adrian's points, it almost seemed like it wasn't one before Margie got up, and then Margie just absolutely destroyed it with really excellent examples, excellent points, like an excellent contrast there. But then Reagan, so I'm thinking the debate is over. I'm thinking and it's too late. There's nothing that the government can do. And Reagan, you really brought it back. You really almost saved the debate. Some really good arguments, some really good points. You almost saved the debate.
Not
So
quite.
it was very close, but I did give the best speaker to Margie tonight. So thank you very much.
And we don't have an agreement with the popular vote. It was a tie.
Whoa.
Oh!
3 for the government, 3 for the opposition.
Speaker cast deciding vote.
Pardon?
Speaker cast deciding vote.
Yes.
Not if she wants to go to the bar.
Yes, Anita, what is your?
I actually think I might have gone for the government.
Might have? But what did you actually do?